New Harbinger Society presents Press Progress investigative journalists Emily Leedham and Stephen Magusiak. Work, bed buses, and how the federal government's Canadian emergency wage subsidy is helping to sustain and support scab labor.
You know, this reminds me, you guys, of my worst boss. And I think I was trying to recollect who it would have been. And I think it was, I was the night manager at the Pita Pit on White Avenue back in the late 90s, early aughts. And it was rad because I was in charge and we just smoked weed all the time and listened to Godspeed You Black Emperor and stayed up until 4 a.m, serving pitas to drunks. But the owner / boss guy got busted embezzling money from his own, he was doing some sort of weird scam. So I guess in terms of just a bad boss, that guy sucked because he's just such a scumbag. So for me, that's probably my worst boss. Emily, how about you? Can you think back to your worst boss?
Oh man, it's more like choosing which was my worst boss out of all the worst bosses. I worked for a boutique clothing store in Calgary once a few years ago, and the guy who owned the business not only owned that, but he owned multiple small businesses and various buildings and properties. And he would ask the girls who worked in his stores if they also wanted to live in the apartment buildings that he owned at a discount in exchange for undefined professional favors, like taking merchandise photos for social media, etc. So basically your wages would circle right back to him in the form of rent. Plus, since he was giving you a discount, you'd end up doing other free labor for him in exchange. And he actually offered me one of these apartments, and I was in a really vulnerable situation at the time, and I almost took him up on it. But I never did, but a lot of other girls did. And the whole thing just gave me really bad vibes. And so whenever I hear people talk about, family-owned small businesses, I just think about that guy because he would always refer to us as a mom and pop shop, but really he kind of owns this whole network of businesses and property in the city. So
okay, that's a bad boss. Stephen, bad bosses, have you had a few? Have you had a specifically bad boss?
Yeah, I was just going over which one. I got one about a particular small business entrepreneur that I worked for when I was in school. I was a gas station jockey, pumping gas at a full serve gas station. And it was a major brand. It was a Shell. So they would send around mystery shoppers to make sure you're really hustling those chocolate bars. Like they're 2 for $2, buy one for everyone who just comes in and buys smokes. You have to upsell. Manager from Calcutta, and she consistently won this mystery shop, and it was a $200 cash prize every single time. She earned about $1,000, but the problem is he only gave the owner of this gas station this highlighted streaked blonde douchebag guy who I will just call Shane, was actually only giving her $500 out of the mystery shop and keeping the other $500 for himself.
Ooh.
He was skimming half of it.
What
This straight up employee theft. Yeah, he actually ended up getting sued by an employee, I think, for some reason. Anyways.
Yeah, for some reason. I wonder why. Well, okay, so this is interesting because both of you guys are describing true scumbaggery. And yeah, it sucks. I mean, bosses often are so shitty. And so, that's one of the reasons why we're lucky to have independent media pushing back against some particularly bad bosses. And Emily, you released a total banger of a piece at Press Progress last week, late April, talking about how the Canadian Emergency Workers Support Benefit is being kind of redirected in a certain way. And it was a really fascinating article. So tell us more about this. What is going on? This is the government subsidy basically that's supposedly allowing businesses to stay afloat in these troubling COVID times, but some of them are using that money in a bit of a sketchy way. What's going on there?
First of all, it's kind of all legal right now. It's called a loophole because there's technically nothing illegal about it. So the Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy was established about a year ago, intended to allow businesses to maintain staff during the pandemic, even if the businesses had experienced a loss in revenue. The way the program was designed, it was designed to be easily accessible in a short period of time, because it was an emergency to, allow the most the businesses that really needed it to not face any barriers or have to jump over too many hoops to get that support. This is what Amin Mawani, a York University business professor who studied the wage subsidy, told me. And he said that it was intended to have kind of fewer restrictions to get this money out really easily. So the only thing a business needs to do to qualify for the subsidy is to show a decrease in revenue. And that decrease doesn't have to be linked to COVID. And you don't have to prove that COVID-19 is the reason why your business faced a loss in revenue. So you can show that you got a decrease, and then you're eligible for up to 75% of the wages of your employees to be covered by the wage subsidy. But since you can report a revenue decrease without having to show the reason, if your workers are on strike or locked out on a picket line, and they're decreasing your productivity, your efficiency, ultimately decreasing your revenues, that itself qualifies you for the wage subsidy. And given that there's no anti-scab legislation in provinces outside of BC and Quebec, you can hire scab workers, replacement workers for the workers that are on strike, and get the government to pay 75% of what those scab workers cost. So this is a huge scab loophole. That's what labor leaders are calling it. And that's kind of been the subject of a couple articles that I've done recently.
And it was so interesting, to read just like how deep you were able to dig on this. And also, I was really surprised to find out only Quebec and British Columbia have strong enough, labor histories that they have defenses against this. And to read your piece is just to see how typical it is, and how this is just it's a huge loophole that is really easy to drive a truck through. And there's so many subcontractors that allow some of these organizations to circumvent the laws. So for instance, the Federated Cooperatives Limited, which is just a dystopian name. This is the old co-op in Saskatchewan, who you reported on back, I think, a year ago when there was a huge lockout of 700 workers at the plant outside of Regina.
Federated Cooperatives Limited is kind of the umbrella organization, and then beneath that you have the retail co-op stores, so they'll be like grocery stores, etc. And then you also have the refinery, so it's kind of like a subsidiary of FCL, which is kind of an umbrella organization. And
they responded to your report, and they sounded kind of defensive, because they were like, well, look, we subcontracted out to Tartan Industrial Contractors, Bowen Group, Agilis Workplace Solutions, just really disturbing names. And they told you that they had applied for the CEWS, but it wasn't supposed to cover scab wages. But this is essentially what's happening, right?
Well, so how it works is that the FCL, they applied for and qualified for the wage subsidy. They're listed in the federal wage subsidy database. So you can look up all the companies that have received the wage subsidy, but you don't know how much they received. You don't know, what their qualifications were for receiving it. So the very fact that they were in the middle of a massive lockout for their refinery, which is kind of one of the most profitable aspects of the co-op, that itself could have been the reason for them experiencing a decline in revenue. We don't know exactly their financials. We can't say for sure what was, qualifying them for the wage subsidy, but they received it in the middle of a big lockout. But they didn't hire the scabs directly themselves. They contracted out third-party contracting companies who came in and provided the services for this big scab camp that was basically set up around the refinery. So they can say, hey, we didn't use the wage subsidy on scabs because we didn't technically employ scabs straight up. But we looked through, and several other of the companies that did provide the scab services are also listed in the wage subsidy database. So these ones like Tartan Industrial, Contractors, Bowen Group, Agilus, they're all listed there. And we don't know what they did with the money. We don't know if the money that they received went directly towards the scabs at the scab camp, because the reporting processes are so vague that we don't know what these companies did with the money. And that's kind of a huge issue that the labor leaders are drawing attention to, because they're like, an employer could manufacture a lockout and use this money, and there's really not very many ways to trace where it's going. And we've seen other instances where companies have used it to kind of line the pockets of their shareholders to pay out dividends. So to say that we should just give them the benefit of the doubt, it's kind of a big issue right now.
And Unifor President Jerry Diaz, he says he doesn't think that the government, the federal government intended to create this loophole, to create this problem. He says, I don't believe for a split second they said, we're going to take sides in this dispute. But the bottom line is they did. You can't subsidize the boss during a lockout or during a strike. The government is inadvertently extending the dispute. Whether it's a strike or a lockout, you can't use wage subsidies. And he says this is something the government could fix quickly. Well, how could the feds fix this quickly? What do you think? Well,
it's important to understand the whole point of a strike or a lockout is to exert economic pressure on the employer. That's the main, the power that workers have is to withdraw their labor or slow down the work procedure, to force the employer to come to the table to, force a quick resolution, basically. That's how the Canadian labor relations regime is designed. That's how it's supposed to work. So if you are trying to exert economic pressure on the employer by withdrawing your labor, and the government comes in and alleviates that economic pressure, then that means that the employer can basically outlast you. And the pressure on the striking workers is greater than the pressure on the employer. And so that can extend a lockout, that can extend a strike, and ultimately kind of lead to more concessions and union busting.
Hear the full episode by supporting Canada's Left podcast community for just $3 a month at harbingermedianetwork.com.